How do the Denver Broncos replace the impact left by the departure of veteran safety Justin Simmons? It's hard to quantify that, but we'll tell you why. There's 3 players on this roster who can help offset that together on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Broncos Country, what's happening? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to all the everydayers out there in Broncos Country who tune in and make us your first listen of the day every single day. Just a reminder, you can get this show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. So do us a favor, if you haven't done so already, hit that subscribe or that follow button so you never miss out on what's going on with your favorite team every single day, all year long. The build-up for training camp continues as we dive deeper into our position preview series, looking at the safety position here for the Denver Broncos. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter from Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantly orange.com. And Sayre, look, as we're kind of winding down here, our position preview series here, the safety position here for the Broncos is probably going to be one of the more intriguing storylines for us to follow going into training camp, going into the preseason, going into the regular season for that matter, just because of the fact that there is one guy who's been a stable part of this team, a stable part of that position since 2016. Justin Simmons no longer here in the Mile High City, and now that leaves a lot of questions. How do the Broncos replace him? How do they replace his impact? I mean, he led the NFL since 2016 in interceptions with 30. He's one of the smartest players on the field and obviously a very well-spoken leader on and off the field inside that locker room. That void is now kind of up for grabs. Like, who's going to step in? And essentially, like we always talk about the term replace. I don't think you can replace the impact that Justin Simmons brought to the table, but you can hope to maybe spread out that production to have as big of an impact maybe as he did. And the Broncos, there's 3 veterans really on this team right now at the safety position that have the chance to do just that.
There's a lot of pressure on these guys, right? I mean, right or wrong, I know that fan perception a lot of times it's not reality, but in this situation, I mean, from week 1, from the first snap of week 1, I guarantee you, if there's an issue at safety, people are going to be wondering, why did the Broncos get rid of Justin Simmons? What were they doing? Even though, for the better part of the last 6 years, there was a lot of fans wondering out loud and foolishly so, why did the Broncos pay Justin Simmons such a big money contract? I mean, you don't know what you got till it's gone, people. And look, we're going to find out whether or not the Broncos are, I can't say better off. I think this is probably the biggest discrepancy in terms of where the Broncos were with Justin Simmons and where they are now with guys like PJ Locke, Brandon Jones, Caden Sterns atop the depth chart. Now, those guys are talented. Don't get me wrong. I mean, PJ Locke has developed really nicely for the Broncos over the last 4 years. And Brandon Jones, former 3rd-round pick, and certainly a talented guy. Caden Sterns, very talented, former 5-star. We know a 5th-round pick of the Broncos who's been productive when given chances. But when you look at losing Justin Simmons, now you're talking, we talked about the quarterback position. You go from Russell Wilson to Bo Nix. People expect that a lot of areas of that position group are going to get better, even with a young rookie coming in, replacing a veteran, one of the best to ever do it. You expect some upgrades at the wide receiver position, despite trading Jerry Jeudy. You've got all these other guys coming back, new guys coming in, et cetera, et cetera. With Justin Simmons leaving the safety position, Cody, this raises major questions about whether or not because the Broncos were terrible when he was out last year injured. I mean, that position group was abysmal, disgusting, embarrassing. And I'm not particularly calling out any one player, but when Justin was gone last year due to injury, it was tough to stomach every single week. This has got to be the biggest concern area of the team right now.
No, and I think you actually alluded to a great point, because I was like, this is probably, Sayre, you could probably write this story up. Like, you can, over at predominantorange.com, you could probably pre-write this story. Let's say the Broncos secondary, as you mentioned, gives up some big plays in that week 1 game against the Seattle Seahawks. There's an opinion piece right there that you could write, like, was releasing Justin Simmons the right move for the Denver Broncos? Like, because that is the looming storyline. That is going to be something that defines this team. And look, I think that does put a lot of pressure on guys like PJ Locke, Brandon Jones, Caden Sterns, just because of the fact that, like, you made this decision ultimately because it was a financial decision. But on top of that, you also made it because you feel like your young guys can help step up. And that you don't make that decision unless you know, like, hey, we believe in these guys, which look, it's great that the coaching staff believes in PJ and Brandon and also in Caden. It's hard to just make that move to depart from a guy like Simmons because of that impact. And I agree with you. Like, there was a night and day difference when you watch the Broncos defense with Justin Simmons. There's a night and day difference without Simmons there on the field. When you needed to play, Justin was always the one guy, I would say, when we talk about clutch defensive player, he probably was the most clutch defensive player the Broncos had on the roster. So now you're trying to figure out, how can these guys do that? You make mention of PJ Locke, the kind of the evolution of him since being on the team since 2019. He's now a starter. He really had some offers in free agency to maybe look elsewhere, decided to come back to Denver. Denver took care of him, and now he's taken on a bigger role here. And now you bring in Brandon Jones from the Miami Dolphins, who's also got the ability to play really effective football. Caden Sterns is going to rotate in quite a bit. Like, the Broncos have positional versatility with these three guys, and it's all about, okay, what is the situation? Can these guys make plays when needed? Caden Sterns, I think the one thing we can highlight about him, when he's on the field, he's a guy that can also have, I'd say, probably out of all these guys, out of PJ and out of Brandon Jones, Caden Sterns probably is the one guy that has the ability to have that ball hawk impact the way that Justin Simmons did, right? And then I look at, guys like PJ, the first Bronco in team history to have at the safety position to have a sack in 3 straight games last year. Him blitzing and getting after the quarterback, forcing fumbles, like, he's got the ability to generate takeaways and turnovers to create it for the defense. He demonstrated that. Brandon Jones, a thumper, can do the same exact thing. So it's just going to be a collective group effort. And I know, like, I just want to encourage Broncos fans here early on, even if the secondary, the back end, the safety group, let's say they don't have the hottest start to the season for the first 3 weeks, I don't think it's a means to panic yet. Like, you got to let these guys take some lumps because they can improve. Look, the Broncos, I don't think it could get any worse than what we saw when they were sitting at 1-5, right? But then what happened? They buckled down a little bit. They started to get more confidence, and then they won 5 games in a row. And all of a sudden, we're like, the whole storyline on the 2023 Denver Broncos changed significantly from that point forward. That's where I think you just have to let these guys go through some of the growing pains. I'm excited to see what Jim Leonard's going to cook up with them from the safety standpoint. These guys like PJ and Brandon and Caden, they're going to be asked to play in the slot. They're going to be asked to roll down and play in the box. They're going to be asked to play the middle of the field coverage. Like, that's really where they're at in terms of what they're being asked to do by Jim Leonard, and also for Vance Joseph in terms of this defensive scheme. I think that these 3 guys have the potential to have an impact. There are some question marks, though, obviously, because of injury history and things like that. Stuff that, it's not the player's fault in terms of that happening, but some things that we have to be cautious about and monitor as we go into training camp. We go into preseason. We go into the regular season here. But ultimately, the Broncos are going to be looking for PJ Locke, Brandon Jones, and Caden Sterns to lead the safety room this upcoming season. But the depth is also going to be very crucial for them as well. And who will make up the Broncos' depth at the safety position? What are some of the young player profiles, like guys like Devon? Can J.L. Skinner take the next step forward? We'll dive deeper to that here on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. Today's Locked On Broncos podcast is brought to you by our friends over there at the Game Time app. And look, Game Time is an authorized ticket marketplace for Major League Baseball. Summer's here, which makes getting tickets faster and easier on the Game Time app, because prices on the Game Time app, they actually go down the closer that it gets to the first pitch. So take your friends, your family out, enjoy an evening out catching some games at the ballpark here this summer with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. One thing I like about the Game Time app is they always have last-minute deals where you can save up to 60% off of buying last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and other events that are going on in your area. Or I like the all-in pricing feature where you can toggle this feature that shows you what your total up front. So when you go to checkout, you're not hit with any surprise fees. You know exactly what the cost is up front. Plus, seat views, you get a panoramic view from the seat in the app before you buy. So take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase today. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed.
It's time for some young players to make their names known at the safety position for the Denver Broncos here in the 2024 season. We're talking safety depth on today's episode of Locked On Broncos as we continue our ramp up in coverage toward Broncos training camp here in 2024, the football season. It is very, very close, Broncos country. And you know what? You need to stay tuned in and locked into Locked On Broncos every single day, wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube, where we appreciate every single one of you going over there. Hit subscribe, join other members of Broncos country, and getting the message out there of Locked On Broncos to other members of Broncos country who, you know what, Broncos country, this roster, we've been evaluating it. What are your thoughts? You let us know over there. And you know what, if you're already on YouTube, go ahead and check out Locked On Sports Today. It's a free 24/7 streaming channel from the Locked On Sports Network where you're going to get all the news, content, coverage, analysis, and more that you want from local experts covering the teams that you love. And it's for free, 24/7 streaming on YouTube. So check that out, or you can check it out on the free Amazon Fire TV channels app as well, right here on the Locked On Sports Network, your team every day. Safety depth. I mean, let's just, I mean, it was tested last year, Cody, and it was not good. And we saw that early on in the season. It was brutal to watch. Caden Sterns was injured early in the season once again, which really stunk to see because, well, the Broncos could have used him right away. And we ended up seeing Delarian Turner-Yell out there, that debacle against Miami, all these different sorts of things here with the safety position going on. But I think we need to start the depth conversation this year with maybe a different guy, a guy that you've mentioned a number of times throughout the course of the offseason, somebody who's been standing out, who could be, I don't know, making a case for the 53-man roster here.
Yeah, no, that's going to be Devon Key. And look, a guy who I watched last year, I felt like in the preseason when you watched him as safety, because he would always get in with the third-team defensive unit, you're not necessarily going to see a lot of plays out of those guys, but Devon Key is a guy who's been kind of just putting in the work, kind of just had his head down, like, on the practice squad all last season. I had a chance to talk with him several times throughout the year inside the locker room, and just got a great attitude and a mindset about him, and always in plug. Like, he's got his iPad on. He's always watching special teams film. And really his thing was, I just need to find a way to get on the field and make some plays and do what the team needs. And he finally, in my opinion, I think it was the last game of the regular season, he actually, if I'm not mistaken, was able to actually play in that game against the Las Vegas Raiders. I got to double check that. But one thing that stands out about me, about him to me, was in mandatory minicamp and OTAs. Brandon Jones was dealing with a little bit of a contusion for a few days and sat some days out there. Devon Key was the guy getting reps next to PJ Locke defensively on the field, and he's doing a really good job in terms of that. Like, well, how do you evaluate that? Well, I look at based on, where they're playing. I can't get into schematic details here because then that is giving away some stuff. And obviously I'm not allowed to report on that stuff, but Devon Key takes great angles to the football. I think his communication, he communicates really, really well pre-snap from what I saw. And from that point forward, there was times where he was making plays on the football. And on top of that, also playing a key role on special teams, like the personal protector on punt unit. Like, that's one of the more important roles in the National Football League, especially on the punt team. So for him to have an increased role on special teams, to get that trust from Ben Kotwika and Mike Westhoff, and to also stand out a little bit to Sean Payton, who said he stacked some good days on there. He's going to get opportunities in this rotation, and I wouldn't be shocked if we see him get some second team reps here in the preseason. Like, he was a third team rep guy last year. I think we'll see him get more second team reps here alongside Tanner McAllister, JL Skinner. I think you'll see a good rotation of guys there. Key is a name for Broncos country to watch, number 26. So when you're attending Broncos camp practices, keep an eye on number 26 when you're watching the defense, when you're watching special teams. But I think we should also talk a little bit now about JL Skinner. Obviously, he's a second-year player here for the Broncos, drafted by them last year out of Boise State. Tall, probably the tallest defensive back the Broncos have on their team. He's a thumper, and that was my biggest criticism of him last year in the preseason, Sarah. I felt like he was always going for the kill shot in some of the preseason games, especially against the San Francisco 49ers, where the Broncos unfortunately gave up the lead that they had. Bad tackling. That was the one thing where you got to see JL Skinner, improve on. But he did take gradual steps forward, because he was mentioned by George Payton specifically, and Sean Payton toward the end of last year is like, these are players who stood out for us, like on the practice squad, who gave us good reps on the scout team. Like, you now need to see that translate into what can they do now if they're on the second team, if they need to be called upon to start because a starter goes down. Can this guy come in and have an impact that's what we really have to see from JL Skinner. I think really out of all the safeties here, the question mark I have is, can JL Skinner take a bigger step here? And look, whether it's in a specific personnel group or whatnot, I think we need to see JL Skinner get on the field at some point this season, not necessarily as a starter, but you have to be able to get on the field. We have to be able to see what he can do. And I think that's an important emphasis here for the safety group this upcoming season.
Especially at special teams with him, right? I mean, you kind of figured when he came out of Boise State, like with the profile that he had as a thumper, as somebody that is the heat-seeking missile out there, the big defensive back with physicality, you expected at the very least that he would come in and contribute on special teams and be a core special teams guy. We didn't see that from him in his rookie season, and so like you mentioned, it was really more so of the notes that Sean Payton and George Payton had in terms of watching him on the practice field as the season progressed and seeing him kind of cut his teeth there. It had to have been a tough year for JL Skinner because there was a lot of people felt like he was a top 100 player in last year's draft class, then suffers the pectoral injury in the pre-draft process, misses out on getting drafted anywhere near the top 100, goes in the 6th round to the Denver Broncos. So it had to have been a humbling year for him, right? To come into the NFL and, maybe could have been picked a lot higher had he been healthy throughout the whole offseason process. But ultimately, you play the hand that you're dealt, right? And with the Denver Broncos, I mean, it wasn't hey, we're going to get this guy on the field by any means necessary. It was more of a tough love type of situation from the way I'm reading it from the outside looking in. I mean, he was buried on the depth chart in the preseason. He didn't contribute at all on special teams of the regular season, had to cut his teeth on the practice field, doing things behind the scenes that nobody else really gets to see in terms of the whole overall season. So I think for him, he's such a mystery to me. I have no idea what to even expect out of JL Skinner in terms of what his development could be, because last year we didn't really see much of anything from him. And this year, well, whatever we get, I think is going to determine, does he even deserve a spot on the 53-man roster?
The Broncos are expecting and hoping that he does take a step forward this upcoming season to where he can have a spot on the active roster. I mean, I would say last year, probably from an outside standpoint, was frustrating for JL Skinner, but I will applaud him on this. I think his mindset, like he could have easily been out there and showcased frustration. He never let like the situation of him not getting reps, not getting on special teams, or at least publicly, he never showed that it bothered him. Like he just always had a great attitude, a great mindset. When we spoke with him in the locker room, he was always just like, I'm excited just to continue to grow as a player. And I know, the time will come for me to be able to step on the field. And I'm excited for whenever that does happen to be able to do that. There has to be in 2024 where we do see that. But look, he's going to have competition as well because there's other guys on this roster that I feel like have some young talent. And obviously, we're going to talk about Tanner McAllister, Keidron Smith, and Omar Brown. Omar Brown, an undrafted rookie free agent. Smith was on the roster a little bit last year, and so was Tanner McAllister. I felt like Tanner McAllister had a pretty good offseason program at OTAs. It kind of threw me off a little bit because he's wearing the number 30. I was like, wait a minute. Like, oh, man, Caden Sterns, man, he got a little shorter, but he's like very, very bulky and muscular. Like McAllister is a guy that's got a body type that I feel like could be a player here for the Broncos and could be this under the radar name at the safety position. I think Broncos fans probably should pay attention to. So when you are at camp, keep an eye on number 30. Like I think he's smart pre-snap, post-snap. He reminds me of similar body type a lot of Brandon Jones. So he could be the backup there for Brandon Jones in terms of that specific role. He's a guy that flies around there. And then obviously, we talk about a guy like Delirian Turner-Yale. Sayre, the reason I think we'll factor him into our conversation here, obviously he's still recovering from ACL surgery. He's made great progress with that. His rehab has gone well. He's sprinting. He's doing things a little bit earlier than I think most people would at this standpoint. So that's a great sign, but I still don't expect him to be ready for the start of the regular season. I think he's going to go on the PUP list to start the year, which means that he's going to have a procured roster spot for whenever he's available to return, which I think will be a good sign for him. But overall, the Broncos' safety depth is going to be very, very interesting in terms of how it plays out behind Caden Sterns, PJ Locke, and Brandon Jones. Can Devin Key or JL Skinner take the reins and emerge? Because they're going to need guys to step up there, especially if there are injuries that do arise here for this team. And so that's one thing that Sayre and I are going to dive into here. What is the Broncos 53-man roster at the safety position going to look like? How many players are they going to keep there? And who makes the roster? We'll debate and discuss that here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. As we jump into the fourth quarter action on today's episode of Locked On Broncos, we just want to say thank you once again to all the everydayers out there in Broncos Country. Thank you for tuning in, making us your first listen of the day every single day. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, we have a brand new episode of the show here for you that you can get on YouTube, or you can get wherever you get your podcast for free every single day, all year long. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Getting into our 53-man roster predictions here. This is always the fun exercise in Broncos Country. Make sure you play along. You share with us who you think is going to make the 53-man roster at the safety position. Sayre, like really starting this off, I feel like we're kind of in agreement here on our top three. Is that it's going to be PJ Locke, Brandon Jones, and Caden Sterns. Now, the question I think we have here is how many players after those three guys do they keep on the roster? Do they keep 6 safeties? Do they keep 5 safeties? Or do they keep 4? Like, where are you at? How many players do you have them keeping here on the roster, and who is it?
Well, I think it depends on the whole defensive backfield is going to play a role in this. And we've talked about it throughout the offseason that some of these DBs are floating between positions, right? Not necessarily corners and safeties to corners, things like that. But these guys are being asked to play versatile roles all over the place. And so I can't help but wonder how much does the cornerback position factor into this, where the Broncos have, frankly, quite a few more guys that I would say are maybe rosterable at this stage between, Pat Surtain, Jaquan McMillan, Riley Moss, Damari Mathis, Levi Wallace, Tremont Smith, Art Green even. And then you get into Chris Abrams-Drain. I mean, there's so many guys at corner right now that it makes me wonder, are the Broncos able to keep four or 5 safeties? I mean, I think 4 at a minimum is what you're looking at here. So beyond the top 3 guys that you mentioned, I'm going with JL Skinner. And like you said, the team expecting that breakthrough season, although you've sold me on Devon Key as well, because I don't know that I've necessarily got 5 safeties, though, still making it. I think I could see that situation playing out. But are the Broncos going to keep 11, 12 defensive backs? How many DBs are they keeping overall? And where does that factor elsewhere on the roster? We think they could keep up to 10 offensive linemen. We think they could keep 5 edge guys, potentially 6 defensive linemen. So like the numbers game ultimately has to add up somewhere. I've got them keeping 4 safeties, and I'll say a coin flip right now in terms of my gut feeling between JL Skinner and Devon Key, maybe even a slight tilt towards Devon Key, even though in my notes I have JL Skinner written down. Maybe Key is that guy that's really going to be that piece of depth for this team in 2024.
Yeah, I mean, that's the dilemma here, right? And I think that's what makes it a little bit challenging from a coaching staff standpoint and from a roster evaluation standpoint. Like if you're George Payton and Sean Payton, you're sitting there and you're sitting with your coaches, and you're like, what do we need the most of this season? Like, where do we need production? Like the defensive backfield is huge for Denver, not just at corner, not just at nickel, but also at the safety position. It really is like those position groups right there, really outside of wide receiver, contain the most guys when you go into training camp from a numbers standpoint. So how do you dwindle that down? How do you play the numbers game? Like, is this going to be a year where the Broncos have more defensive players than they have offensive players when they're trying to build their 53-man roster? Like, that is the hard part about doing that. And look, I know in a future episode of the show, we're going to build the 53-man roster ourselves. You and I are going to give our own 53-man roster predictions at some point, probably right before the preseason ends here. But the challenge I think that's associated with this is that exact thing that you were mentioning, the numbers game. Like for me, if the Broncos keep 6 cornerbacks, okay, there's that. Then, that means they probably keep 5 safeties there. So 11 defensive backs. Could you maybe lean towards 12? Yeah, possibly. I think it really just depends on your personnel and how you view it. Can one of these guys that play the safety position in terms of, and also special teams, can they overtake a guy like Tremont Smith, who was one of the team's top gunners, on special teams for them? Like, that's where I think it's all about, okay, how do these guys fit the mold of what the team needs from that position in terms of guys being backups to a starting position, but also translating that into, if they're going to be a backup, they need to be a starter, at least on special teams. So how do you factor that into the equation? A guy like Tremont Smith's probably not going to play a lot of cornerback for the Broncos. He didn't play a lot of cornerback last year. And to be honest with you, he struggled in the preseason playing cornerback. So is that where you're like, okay, we're building this roster, we feel like we're going to need more safeties this upcoming season? That's why I've got them keeping 5. I've got PJ Locke, Caden Sterns, Brandon Jones. I've got Devon Key, and I do have JL Skinner because I think that JL still has a lot to prove, essentially. And I don't think that the team is willing at this point, Sayre, to really kind of give up on him. And I don't think Broncos fans should give up on him as well. I know you saw a lot of like the game day inactives list last year. Like anytime the Broncos published it before a game and it said JL Skinner inactive, a lot of Broncos fans are like, well, he's a bust. He can't get on the field. Just because he's not getting on the field right away doesn't mean that he's a bust. I still think that JL is still growing as a player. And look, the reality for a guy who's drafted in the 6th round, 5th round area, a lot of these guys aren't necessarily going to play right away, to be honest with you. And look, I think Caden Sterns was a little bit of an anomaly in a sense because he showcased the ability to be a ball hawk early on. Vic Fangio established trust in him. And when you put him on the field in regular season, what did he do? He intercepted Dak Prescott. He intercepted, a lot of players. He sacked Lamar Jackson. Like, he was the Lamar Jackson equalizer in that one game, even though the Broncos got mollywopped at home a couple years ago when they went for it on that 4th down situation there. But, I mean, you have to make the most of your opportunities. And I think that's where we're really going to see some questions here from guys like JL Skinner, Devon Key. Like, they're going to get opportunities in the preseason. Don't get me wrong. The opportunities are going to be there. Do they capitalize on it? When you get those chances, how many plays do you make on the football? Are you finding yourself aligned correctly pre-snap? Like, you have to do like the little things outside of just making football plays. You have to do all the other things right as well. I think that's where we're going to see this safety room in particular. I think we'll be pleasantly surprised. I think that the Broncos, the philosophy they have under Jim Leonard, I think it allows the safeties to play a lot more free in comparison to what we have seen the last couple of years. And I think that there's going to be some young guys that do emerge here, which I think is the best case scenario. You want to see that happen, considering that Justin Simmons is no longer on this roster. But you do have guys like PJ Locke and Caden Sterns who have been in that locker room with Justin, who've been in that locker room with Kareem Jackson, have learned things from those guys. And now they're going to be able to pass that information on and be those guys for these young guys in the locker room. To me, that's going to be imperative for the Broncos safety room this year if they're going to have success.
And for people out there that are maybe wondering, could Justin Simmons actually come back? Like we've said throughout the offseason, like, don't close the door on anything. Never say 0% chance, right? And obviously, Justin is a talented player and should be coveted by a lot of teams. I was just thinking about this other day, Cody, like, how does Kevin Byard go out and get a 2-year deal in free agency worth $15 million at the same age? He's a little bit older even than Justin Simmons. I just don't understand it. I don't get it. I mean, if Justin is not signed by the time training camp starts, I would start to wonder if I'm the Denver Broncos. I'd start to say, hey, Chris Abrams-Drain, don't get used to number 31 because you might have to change your number here in a little bit. I wouldn't mind seeing that, but I do wonder, like, would it take another major injury at the position, right? Or would it take maybe one of the guys that's supposed to be key depth at the position getting hurt, something like that? So not just a PJ Locke or Brandon Jones or Caden Sterns injury, but like, let's say Devon Key gets injured. Now all of a sudden you have to reshuffle everything else, So I don't know. I don't want to get anyone's hopes up either, because at the same time of saying, well, it makes sense on paper right now. I mean, he's still out there and the Broncos safety position is still a question mark. But for Justin, does it make sense? I mean, maybe he's still living in Denver and will continue to do so. But does it make sense from him from the standpoint of who else could be offering him, a short-term contract? Like, he would be taking a pay cut to come back to the Broncos. That's why they cut him from the roster in the first place, was to get that salary freed up. So I don't know where you stand on this, Cody. I know some people say it's hot take to even bring it up, but look, fans are asking about this all the time, and they're wondering, like, the longer time goes on, is Justin still an option to come back? I would say don't close the door, but don't get your hopes up at the same time.
I think that's the best way to put it. And I can tell you this, Justin does have some interest from several teams around the league, according to people that I've talked to. Like, there are a couple of teams that are interested there. I think Justin at this point is just evaluating what he wants to do. Like, it's the offseason right now. He's training at Landau every single day. The thing is like, he's not just going to stand by and just like wait. Like, he's preparing to play this season. And so it's not a question of can he play? We all know he can play. He's one of the best safeties in football. I think the question for him is it a situation that makes sense for him at this point of his career? I think he wants to play for a contender, which rightfully so. He deserves it. He deserves a chance to win. There are going to be some teams that do call a little bit, and I do expect him, like, I'm with you, Sayre. I would be shocked if he's not on a team by the start of training camp. I think there's going to be some teams that start to maybe amp up their interest and maybe even a little bit more money at this point as well to get him, because there are some teams out there in need of a safety, and Justin would be a great addition from a veteran standpoint on and off the field for some team. And it could be the Denver Broncos as well. But with that said, Broncos country, let us know who you have making the roster at the safety position here for the Broncos. How many players and who are they? Make sure you let us know if you're listening to us or watching us wherever you get your podcasts. We're available on YouTube. But for all you everydayers out there, here's what you can expect on tomorrow's episode of the show. Sayre and I, we're going to break down the Broncos cornerback room. Questions arise. Who's going to emerge outside of Patrick Surtain, who is the team's star player on this entire roster? But who are the cornerbacks that Broncos Country needs to keep an eye on during training camp? We'll break that down and much more on tomorrow's brand new episode of the show.